We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back speaking with Liberty Nation senior political analyst, Mr. Tim Donner. Tim, let's go straight into my favorite topic, and I'm sure it's one of yours, battleground states, polling, and what that means for the election. Now, yes, it's 5 months out, so a lot can change in that time. But you and I, we delve deep into the polls. We are always looking for any new polls that come out. And of course, most of all, certainly for me, I enjoy looking at the average of polls to get a better idea of what's happening. And in the battleground states, the 7 key states that will be decisive in every election, it's pretty fascinating what's happening, isn't it, Tim?
Well, Mark, basically out of the 50 states in the Union, 40 of them are considered safe for either Trump or Biden. That leaves 10 states, 3 of which Biden is favored in, Virginia, Minnesota, New Hampshire, but where Trump has vowed to campaign. That leaves 7 more states where the election will be decided, as you said. Now, in 4 of those states, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada, Trump has leads that are either outside the margin of error or close to outside the margin of error. I think both campaigns think that those states have become safe for Trump if they weren't already. That leaves 3 states remaining in the Rust Belt: Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Those are the states that Trump flipped in 2016 to win the presidency. Those are the states that Biden flipped in 2020 to win the presidency. Now, Trump's path to 270 electoral votes there's a lot more paths to that mountaintop for Trump than for Biden. It's pretty much clear at this point that in order to be elected again, Joe Biden will have to win Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan. He's going to have to win all 3 and then figure out how to get one more electoral vote, because those 3 states, together with the safe states that Biden has that he won in 2020, gets him to 269, 1 short of victory. And
Nebraska?
Then he would go for the 1 vote in the Nebraska Omaha area, which is the most liberal area of a deep red state. And that gets him to 270. But in 2016, Donald Trump was thought to have to pull an inside straight, and he did. So given that Joe Biden has the advantages of incumbency, also the disadvantages, he's got a record he's got to run on. I think his campaign is going to have him basically live in the Rust Belt for the rest of this campaign, because those are the places he has to win. And while he's doing pretty well in Michigan and Wisconsin, he's got trouble in Pennsylvania. And there's no question, I think people can universally say whoever wins Pennsylvania wins this election. It was true in 2016. Well, you could go back all the way really to 1992. Like Pennsylvania has picked the winning candidate except in 2000. But that's considered the bellwether state. If Trump wins Pennsylvania, he wins the election. If Biden wins Pennsylvania, he could win the election.
Yeah, it's interesting to note the different pathways and do the electoral math for the Electoral College count. And as you rightly say, there are more combinations that can get Trump over the 270.
At this point in time, depending on, of course, on how polling changes based on Donald Trump's conviction.
Yes, well, there's been very little polling come out since the conviction. So there's plenty of polling. There's several polls that came out on the 31st, but they were carried out over a period of time before the actual conviction came down. So I'm not sure they're reflective of things. But let's talk general polling a bit, if we may. The average of polls, according to Real Clear Politics at the moment, has nationally Donald Trump up half a point. Now, that's sure that includes all these outlier polls as well, so we can't really take that as read. But something that you pointed out to me a couple of weeks ago when we first saw this trend developing was that during 2016, 2020, Donald Trump was never ahead in the national polling. Now, it's fascinating that he is now, but what do you think that means for his coattails? If that polling holds true, what does that mean in terms of Senate and House?
That's a key question, Mark, because as of now, the polling in key Senate races show Democrat senatorial candidates running well ahead of Joe Biden. So that I think Democrats are focusing on, or they may have to eventually focus on trying to keep the Senate and win the House, because Joe Biden is such a weak candidate, and there's so many rumblings in the highest levels of the Democratic Party about, open panic about Joe Biden's chances and the concept of Donald Trump returning to the White House. So Democrats are trying to make the case that they're going to do very well nationally in congressional elections, even though Joe Biden may not win at the national level. Of course, they're not saying that, but it's implicit in their actions and their statements. So Joe Biden will have zero coattails because nobody really outside of his wife thinks he's the best candidate that the Democrats could come up with for president, but he's what they've got. He's the incumbent, and he won in 2020. In terms of Trump, that's a very intriguing question, because there have been some Republicans who have tried to distance themselves from Trump or try to balance off being a more traditional Republican as opposed to a MAGA Republican. But I think a rising tide really does lift all boats, Mark. And I think Donald Trump's success will translate to Republicans, but not to the degree people might expect. I mean, look, Barack Obama was an almost legendary political figure. He won 2 elections. He was the first Black president, but he had no coattails. I mean, he won, but his party went to hell, in essence, in terms of the bench of talent that they had available to run for national elections in the future. And to some extent, that's happened with Trump, that Trump, just like Obama, is a unique figure. There's nobody like him. There never will be. And so trying to sort of say, hey, I'm like Donald Trump too, has not worked terribly well for a lot of politicians who are trying to run on his coattails. In 2020, Trump endorsed some candidates, including for governor of Pennsylvania, people who were just not thought to be ready to serve. But he endorsed them, and they lost. And, you can say that the Republican Party didn't support these candidates properly because they thought they were losers. It's a circular argument that can be made. But certainly, I can say this much. I believe Donald Trump will have a hell of a lot more coattails than Joe Biden in 2024.
Very much so. I think that's pretty much spot on, Tim. And one final question for you, if I may. Do you think that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. will have an outsized impact on this election due to whatever reasons at all? But your take?
You know what? Whether you like Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s politics or not, whether you like the Kennedy family or not, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. comes off as a person who's very serious, deadly serious, and intellectually honest. He truly believes what he says. They aren't talking points. They're not designed to attract voters to some giveaway, right? He did the right thing, it seems, after the Trump trial. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. said, this is a very dangerous precedent to set in this country. Now, he could have said, see, Trump is nothing and Biden's incompetent, vote for me, but he didn't. He said, this is a very dangerous turn of events for the country, and good for him to identify what's at stake here. And because he has, Yeah, I think his vote share is going to go up. I think it's reasonable to think he could get about 10% now, but I think that really could go up when the number of people decide they have to pick between a convicted felon and a guy who often presents as a zombie. So, yes, I think
Only in America.
I think Robert F. Kennedy is looking good to more people now than he did before.
Tim Donner, thanks ever so much for being with us today.
Always a pleasure, Mark.
And that's just about all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American network from a flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC. I've been your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to take a moment to thank our guest today, Mr. Tim Donner. Thank you for joining us, and thank you at home for taking the time to tune in and listen in each and every week. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com. You can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. See you next week. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.